Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Kimberly Unger, author of The Extractionist, published by Tachyon, and it'll be released later this week. Her first novel was Nucleation. Kimberly lives and writes in a VR world, as perhaps all of us do here in the simulation, and produces narrative VR games. She lectures on art and code and their intersection at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She works on the future of the very VR we're going to be talking about today in this conversation, and that is primarily on the Meta-Oculus gaming platform, which is incredibly exciting and scary. So, The Extractionist, it's about a process and a person. The idea of extricating someone who's so immersed in a virtual environment by circumstance or by conscious decision that an external force is required to pull, in this case, him out. So at that point, enter Eliza McKay, or just McKay. And from then on, we're in the swim, along with various mites and sprites and Mike, and the well-drawn group of characters, either assisting her or preventing her from accomplishing her assigned task. So The Extractionist talks about a future that is, as happens oftentimes now, kind of almost here and being brought to us in good part by Kimberly in this book and in real life, whether we like it or not. So hi, Kimberly, thanks for being here today.
Hi there. Thanks for having me on board. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, I think so too. So, I was thinking of the concept of a person, and if you do that, it's like, okay, there's a person, there's a personality, there could be an avatar, and in this case, you posit a persona, as McKay is dealing with. And then I thought, okay, who is the me? I mean, we're talking about these different things. And I remember in one of your talks, you gave this analogy of a sketch of a lake versus a photograph of a lake.
Right.
I kind of feel that all fits in, right?
Mm-hmm. It does. I mean, in the world of the extractionist, the me is the meat version of you, right? The actual sort of physical version. When you go into the swim, if you don't have the special equipment that someone like McKay has, what they're doing is they're taking all of the things about a brain or about a personality that make you, all your little quirks and stuff, and they're hanging it on an artificial intelligence. And then that is what is in the swim for most people. McKay and the group like her can actually write in and out on the fly. So in McKay's case, that's literally the me interacting with technology. But in the case of someone like Mike, that's actually more of a construct. And what happens is when you're in the swim, when you're doing these interactions, if you have a state change, if you experience an epiphany or a sudden understanding, the pieces of you that were copied over don't fit neatly anymore. It's hard to copy them back out to your actual meat brain. And that's when an extractionist is needed. So it's not it's not a hugely common event. A lot of people just elect to drop the experience and they say, okay, this was a bad trip. And they just dump everything and go back to being themselves. But sometimes it's a special case. Like if you're a nuclear physicist and you're trying to solve a new problem about, fusion interactions, and you suddenly get it while you're doing your math in the swim, then you want to take that back with you. And if you get stuck, if it's a big enough realization, then you call in someone like McKay to sort of figure out how to fit all those pieces back out. It's a little art. It's a little science on her part.
It's funny because talk about like a phase change, or that's what nucleation is too. It's like a phase transition. The observer's watching, water turn to ice. It's just a thermodynamic change. And although this is what I do. I go off on things. Sorry, I apologize.
That's awesome, though.
We're trying to sell books. But, you know, and I'm going to push this, but like, okay, your personality is the actual traits that you develop, that you portray to the world. But
Right.
a persona is an affectation in a way. It's an affectation of what you're doing. So when she's trying to extract his persona, like I said, I'm pushing this.
Sure.
What is she? It's not the person. It's not the essence of the person. It's what that person presents to what you and I are doing right now. This is not us. We're just presenting the way we want the world to perceive us.
To a certain degree, that's exactly right. And really the tricky bit with Mike, because he's a spy, because part of his job in the swim is presenting as somebody else, as being something a little bit other than he might be, you couple that with the state change that Mike has experienced. And that's what makes it so difficult. And that's why Rose failed to write him out originally, right? Another hacker who's as competent as McKay, just with a different methodology behind what she does. The reason she's unable to write him out is because of that level of complexity, that he's got two or three layers deep on what he's doing in there. So it's the things that go into making a persona really are the things that make you special. The way you regard a problem, the way part of your brain developed because you grew up on a farm with cows, as opposed to the way part of your personality developed because you grew up in a city with dogs. Those are the things that get copied over, and those are the things that you try to copy back. And honestly, if there's something that's exactly the same that has unchanged, then you can just dump that. Right? Like if you're in the swim and you never touch a core memory, like of when you're 5, or you never touch on your your love of fine wines, right? That's going to remain the same between your digital copy and your real copy, or the real you. And so when you copy back out, you can just dump that, right? Because nothing has shifted there. It's really about copying out the new things that got added on while you were in the swim. So it's and there's a little bit of theory of mind behind this, right? When children start to develop, and everybody has preconceived versions of other humans sort of in their brain, right? And you hang the new specific things about every person you meet on this sort of core idea of person that you have. And so that was sort of the basis for the way the technology works in the Extractionist, is that there are these sort of basic artificial intelligences that have been developed, and that for the persona process, you're just sticking the specials to make the swim version of somebody.
Isn't it interesting how like Neuromancer was in 1984, Waldo and Magic is in 1950, and here you are taking these things that were like this author we were talking about before we started, taking these things that were posited that that didn't exist, and even then you thought it was near future, and here you are now, both in fiction and in real life, creating those things that were only dreams. I mean, you're standing on the shoulders of giants, kind of, right?
I absolutely am. And to be honest, in my writing, you will see little references to the things that came before, because I'm not arrogant enough to think that I created this out of whole cloth, right? I mean, there's decades of reading that I've done in this work, right? And now to be clear, interestingly enough, I finished the first few drafts of The Extractionist before the Kickstarter for Oculus went off, before that happened, before Google Cardboard, before Oculus happened. So I don't claim to be, for anything in The Extractionist, to be tightly tied to the work that I've been doing at Meta. That evolved independently. But the research I did for The Extractionist helped convince me that the work that we're doing in virtual reality right now is going to fly, that this is the next actual progressive step in sort of general computing that will take us from having a laptop on your desk to just having a pair of glasses that you carry around with you. which I think will be the ultimate state of things.
Well, what about, I guess let's talk a little bit about McKay and the manner in which she's essentially constructed, because it's,
Mm-hmm.
Right now you have Elon Musk attempting to begin that very process.
Yep. It's, so McKay is on sort of the bleeding edge of all of this hardware. So she actually has gone the extra step of having, computer technology implanted in her, predominantly in her brain, a little bit in her body. And that's what allows her to do all of this live, right? Whereas with the persona process, your average person, they knock them unconscious, they make a copy, that copy does all the stuff in the swim. You keep the person unconscious so that they don't experience some kind of state change that'll screw up the copying back and forth. And then you write them back out again. So that's sort of it's a higher friction process for most people. For McKay, though, it's as simple as putting on her headset or even just, connecting her Wi-Fi to the internet, and she can do that live at any given point in time. She just has to close her eyes and make the connection. So for her, the process is actually a little more dangerous because that direct connection into the digital world bypasses all of the safeguards that we experience in real life. As you get older, as you go through and you touch things and you bump into things and you hear loud noises and you get close to the fireplace, you slowly get inured to all of this sensory input, right? And so the things that may have bothered you as a child, having tags in the back of your shirt, or the fire alarm when it goes off because you burned dinner, by the time you get to be in your 30s, that's usually tamped down a lot. The process that McKay does going into the swim, all of that's bypassed. So if she experiences something in the swim that's catastrophic, that's PTSD inducing, that is going to have a severe effect, that writes back out and it goes right into her brain, and it misses all of these real life safeguards that the brain has developed over time. So it's a riskier proposition, but it's faster and it's cleaner. And so she, as an expert, she has accepted the risk because most of what she does is basic computer engineering, right? She develops AIs for a living. She used to develop nanotechnology for a living. And so she's usually in, a development environment, fairly safe. And so she's made that exchange. But when she does something like an extraction, that's different, right? It's her unvarnished personality brushing up against, all of the hazards that might be out there, including, other people, their personas, other hardware, other software. So it's a riskier proposition, which makes it a little bit easier to sort of heighten the drama than I would if she was just sitting typing in front of a keyboard.
Well, it's funny because I guess for readers, or when this book comes out, and the day it comes out, it'll be in my bookstore along with Nucleation. For those who don't have context, I guess what we're talking about needs to be put on a template of the swim and an overlay. It's what is, first of all, why am I calling it the overlay? What is it called? The overview? There
is an overlay. The overlay is the name. Yeah.
So you dive into the overlay and then you're in the swim. And if somebody's trying to kill you, they appear as a monster digging their claws into this metal floor, but they're not.
Right.
So talk a little bit about that, because that's what we're in. All we've been talking so far about is character. So let's talk about what you're actually in. Sure.
So the swim is an embodied internet, right? It is a version of the internet now that you can react and interact with in a natural fashion, right? You don't have to think about clicking the mouse. You don't have to think about typing in www, right? You hop in and you say, okay, this is where I want to go. You can follow their sort of versions of road signs. The one of the differences between the internet and the swim is the swim is also the conduit by which all of the systems connect together. So the swim as sort of at the bottom of the swim where most people don't go, that's how, Microsoft talks to Amazon. And that's where, your university library may talk to the Oxford University Library, right? There's this underlying deep layer of cross communication that almost every computer system uses. And that's really McKay's talent, is being able to get down through the swim, through the internet, the commonly understood piece, into the underlying structure of everything. Now, the overlay is really the artificial intelligence that she has on her computer system that helps her do this navigation. It provides a visual translation, the same way that what we see on the World Wide Web is a visual translation of, the information that you might have on any given website. The overlay handles a lot of that translation, and it tries to deliver things that she wants. It's almost like a super aggressive, super advanced form of Alexa, right? Like all she has to do is think something that she is interested in understanding, or interested in knowing, or interested in seeing, and the overlay helps provide that translation. So she's not doing it by hand all the time. So it's almost it's, in the very beginning of the book, the overlay pops up and it's kind of annoying, the way that our in-home assistants can kind of be fairly annoying, right? Like if I say, hey, Google, then my Google in the house wakes up immediately and starts listening to try and figure out what I want. And, that's a service, right? They want to sell me something at the end of the day. But that's kind of what the analog, modern day analog for the overlay actually is.
When you're talking about that, and when you're talking about Alexa and Google, remember when Microsoft, this is an analogy, don't be offended by it, but remember when Microsoft had that guy, Bob, who was totally useless and the worst font in the world, but she has the way it should have been. She has Spike.
Yes.
So Spike is really cool because you don't expect him there, and you don't expect him to be like, who's the guy in Midsummer Night's Dream? The cool
Puck.
guy. But yeah, you don't expect him to be like Puck and have that same sense of humor. So talk about him, and where the hell did he come from?
So Spike is ultimately a bit of a cautionary tale. Spike is a search engine, but he's been built on top of a persona, right? And so Spike is really why you don't use a persona, which is normally a copy of a person, to build an artificial intelligence. Because an artificial intelligence, like the ones that we see in the warehouse at the end, are very task oriented, and they will do what they are asked to do because that's what they're designed for. For Spike, somebody took a persona, a copy of a real person, and then applied sort of an AI structure or AI instruction on top of it. So that sort of mashup, first of all, it's rare in this universe. They don't tend to last long. And the reason Spike has lasted as long as Spike has is because in McKay and in McKay's group of friends, they have a human interaction that they couldn't get elsewhere. And this is all world building stuff that's not actually in the book, but I might make use of it at some point in the future. So Spike is really a persona with extras that just happens to be banging around, and they've attached themselves to McKay in part because McKay knows their creator, but also in part because that's what allows them to keep going. The persona core of Spike needs people. And that's why they're always so engaged and being a pain in the ass and, hey, look at me, senpai. And like, they're like a younger sibling that's always trying to get your attention, because that's what they need in order to keep going.
Well, it's funny because since I'm old, I only used Oculus one time when my friend Lorelei, who was like 11 at the time, obviously and way more advanced than me, I put it on. I was playing that stupid fishing game, trying to catch fish. And all of a sudden, Lorelei says, watch out, And of course, in the real world, I'm ready to hit my knee on a table and fall over on my face. Do you ever find yourself in what you're doing realizing that I interviewed this guy, David Chalmers, who wrote this book, Reality Plus, who essentially says that the virtual world is just as real as our day-to-day quotidian world. And you've got to be getting to that point where, do you ever catch yourself like thinking, well, I'm here, but I'm not here? Not even that, you just forget?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's part of the goal, right? I mean, there's a couple of different ways virtual worlds go. And if you look at, some of the early research that's been done, our brains interpret it as real. So, the Stanford did a research, I think about 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that shows that memories in virtual reality reflect in the brain in the same location as actual real world physical memories do. But memories, if I'm playing a video game on a flat screen, do not. They go to a different spot in the brain. So there is some sort of underlying science that suggests that our brains think of the virtual world as real, right? Or as real as, the table in front of you. The tricky part with VR in particular is the glorious diversity of everybody's own home, right? Right now you've got to like clear a space to do stuff in VR, because you need to be able to walk around a few steps. You don't want to punch the wall on accident, which I've done more than once, right? Flinging an arm out. There's a guardian that pops up that says, hey, the wall's right there. But if you're in full motion, you do not have time to stop when you get to that space. Eventually we will get to the point where we can reskin your room, right? So every object in your room can be tracked and replaced with a virtual version of it, so you don't bump into your couch anymore, or you don't bump into the walls anymore. Like, that's the dream, is having a one-to-one reskin. What I find particularly entertaining is stuff like in Ready Player One, right? You've got crowds of people with headsets on running down the street, doing things in groups. And if you've ever spent time in sort of our current versions of virtual reality, whether it's the HTC headsets, or whether it's the Lenovo headsets, or even the Meta headsets, there's constraint there. Doing that, is running down the street, is actually pretty difficult, because it's just, at the moment, we don't yet track all the stuff in the space, and we can't show it to you, and then there's game design elements, like how do you design a game that will reorganize the gameplay field depending on where your couch is, right? Or depending on how many desks or tables you have in the room. But it's all a good problem to solve for in a lot of ways. Sort of finding ways to allow people to personalize that space, so that they can interact, more effectively, not just with games, but, the vision ultimately will be, a general computing platform, right? Having a pair of glasses instead of a laptop. So you can just put them on in the coffee shop and do your thing, and then, put them in your pocket, or turn your sunglasses on and off, and have it be ubiquitous. It's just, games are the path to get farther down that road.
One time you said, what did you say? You said something about speaking to what people have in their head. It reminded me of like Steve Jobs saying, I'm inventing something that people don't know they want, and I think you're going that way, but to play devil's advocate, it is scary, because you're creating something, for some guy who doesn't have an exciting life, or some woman who doesn't have an exciting life, and they can create an avatar that's complete, extremely handsome and athletic or beautiful or whatever. You're creating something that they're going to want to be in more, but they still have to get up and eat. They still have to get up and poop. And you're making it very difficult. It's like the movie Avatar, where I'm always wondering, what the hell are they doing while they're in that pod? They have to eat, they have to exercise, they have to do something. But aren't you getting to that point? A lot of people would say that they're not coming out, just like Mike. They're not coming out. And where's the body? Where the hell is the body in the book, until you, not to be a spoiler, but until you find out where the body is?
Sure. And, one of the hand wavy bits with virtual reality, particularly in movies and particularly in books, what you do with the body is kind of the hand wavy piece, right? It's, It's, oh no, we're going to put you in a pod and we're never going to talk about what happens in the pod, right? And for me, that's where we start to tip over into like body horror, right? With like in the Matrix, the giant plugs that we have in all of those characters. That's very lightly touched on, and nobody really gets into it because it is sort of the squeaky side of long-term immersion. 18 hours, 24 hours, 2 days. There's with any form of communications technology, there's always a draw, right? Especially if it's social, especially if you can connect to other live humans, even if you're wearing a different character, right? That brings people back to it over and over again. It allows people to make connections that they might not otherwise be able to make, right? But, the real world is still a very important piece of that. Yes, the technology exists for you to put on a headset and hook yourself up to a feeding tube and, a colostomy bag and like never come back out again. But that's all very extreme, like a very extreme scenario. There's still a lot of biological satisfaction and sort of biological need for the real world, right, to exist, for people to come back out. People can get touch starved, right? And this can happen even without computers, right? If they're isolated too much or too long. People need to eat, people need to shower, people need to do all of these things. And part of that is, real life is one of being drawn back to real life, and your real life responsibilities is sort of one of the counters to a truly 100% immersive experience. If you take a movie like, what was it called? Not Scanners, Surrogates, that came out a number of years ago now, right? This was one of the issues that they were sort of talking about, is if everybody can be, a Waldo or a robot or a perfect version of themselves that's immortal and indestructible, then what happens to the people left at home? What happens to the body of the person? And in some cases, in some cases it doesn't work out, right? Some cases people get very isolationist and they stop going outside and they stop interacting with other people.
Right.
But in the majority of cases, the real world is enough of a draw to counter sort of these fantastic, idealized, perfect virtual environments. And I'm hoping that will continue to be the case.
I don't know if the real world isn't that interesting.
I think there's things in the real world that pull you back, right? Like there are companies working on like smell technology, right? Smell is one of the most powerful human experiences.
Very evocative. It's incredibly
very evocative. And those are the kinds of things when you hear people talk about traveling, smell is one of the things they pick up on all the time. Like this market smells like this, or the woods smell like that. Those kinds of things that we can't yet do in VR those are the hooks in the real world that draws. Even if it's just the smell of your garbage that you forgot to take out 2 or 3 days ago, smell is a driver for us.
It's like when McKay goes back to her hovel of a house and her brother's laying in bed, and it's like, I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, this isn't really as nice as where she was.
Yep.
And hey, do you guys ever, like when you're working with your colleagues, do you ever have like I did, dorm room discussions at 3 o'clock in the morning when I was tripping, and it's like, we could be in a solipsistic universe right now, or a simulation where one of us is talking. We wouldn't change our behavior, but only one of us is here. I don't know which one. Or, and you work for a company called Meta. The idea of Meta is totally self-referential. Mm-hmm. We had a label maker, and one of my employees, she labeled the stapler, and the hole punch, like naming your cat. Or the bar is the bar. Doesn't that start making your brain hurt?
It does a bit. I mean, I work for, Meta is the broad company, and I really feel that, the name change is to help lock in the sort of the company state change. Like what they're now moving away from purely being social to this larger. And I think that the name ended up the way it did, in part to help sort of lock that in everybody's mind. So it is definitely self-referential and probably deliberately so. My particular corner of Meta is Reality Labs, which is specifically lensed at augmented reality, virtual reality, sort of the next, sort of that driving the development of the developer ecosystem that will be needed to serve all of this, all of these virtual experiences in the future. And yeah, I mean, our discussions go all kinds of interesting places. I mean, it's like, as I've said before, it's like working on the enterprise. Like every single person I work with is like, they're smarter than I am. They're faster than I am. They've got, and we've all got very different, very deep experience on things. And everybody loves to, sort of cross discuss what could be next, what's going on, why are we looking at this? There's a lot of strategic thinking involved with regards to, okay, we want to bring this product to the platform, not necessarily because we think it's going to change the world, but there's a piece of it that can then start driving the evolution of a particular tool, right? Or a particular type of product. Like if you look at the applications that we have coming out, which is a different group than the games, we're bringing in stuff that allows you to host meetings with people. And it brings in, stuff that allows you to create, like you could potentially create book covers in there and then translate them out or have them in a virtual reality format, right? They're pushing all of that other stuff as well. So it's not just thinking about, hey, this game is going to make $1 million. It's what can we get people experimenting with that will feed sort of the development further down the line. And a lot of those 3 a.m. type discussions get sort of headed in that direction.
It's funny because what you're talking about, like a conference room, and you mix game with work. So well, look, I'm looking at my theoretical desktop. I see your piece of paper that has my notes. I put it in a folder and that goes into another folder hierarchically, but none of that is true. And then I can throw it in the trash if I want, but it's not in the trash. And what you were positing in one of your interviews were the idea of having you all meet at the conference room table. Maybe someone comes in, takes their briefcase and puts it on the side because it's something that's going to come up later, or puts his hat in the hat rack, which doesn't mean the hat is on the hat rack. It means something else. And I don't know where I'm going. You talked about it. So you continue the idea that these icons, these metaphors are just going to continue becoming more and more actually what we live. It is now. I'm doing it right this second.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're building something new, right? There's and again, my context is usually video games because that's where I have spent a good chunk of the past 20 years. You sort of braid together, or you breadcrumb people through from a real world experience into a virtual experience or into a new experience. There's a learning process or an onboarding process. And I'll even point you at Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics as a way to use visual metaphor to make a connection to the reader or to make a connection to the viewer. So right now we are working with a lot of visual metaphor. The example of hanging a hat on the hat rack, which isn't actually a hat, and it's not actually a hat rack, and you're not actually physically taking the action. But it's touching a pattern in somebody's head, right? Like we all develop patterns in day-to-day life. You get up in the morning, you have your coffee, you make your eggs, you let the cat out. And on the day something interrupts that, the rest of your day is kind of like, it doesn't quite work right? Like if you only have 1 cup of coffee instead of 2, or you let the cat out before you make the eggs because they're having a really bad morning, right? It sort of throws everything off. So some piece of what's being developed in virtual reality is to speak to the real world experience, to allow people to bring those patterns of behavior over so that they're comfortable, and it helps develop and understanding. This is why we have the desktop metaphor for Windows, right? Or for Mac. It's literally speaking to what desktops used to be like. You had your Rolodex, you had the trash can under your desk, you had folders and notepads. And in order to make the computing experience easier, they took all of that language and copied it over. And we'll do that, for virtual reality in the future. We'll copy over your laptop experience or your desktop experience because that's already familiar. And then the evolution will continue from there, right? When I'm working in Word, it's no longer a direct analog for the typing on a typewriter, right? It's evolved beyond that after a number of years. So we'll see the same thing happen with virtual reality is we're taking a known existing real life thing, making a series of metaphors you can interact with. And then once you're familiar and comfortable, you just sort of naturally move beyond that as a player or as a user.
Not to make you the bad guy, which a lot of people do, like say Elizabeth Warren or someone like that. I mean, I remember, in all your bios, you talk about 80 columns versus 40 and the Apple IIc. And I remember the Sinclair ZX80 that I had with,
nice.
With a 13-inch black and white TV and a little cassette recorder. I didn't know what to do with it. There wasn't anything you could do with it. Maybe Pong,
sure.
a tiny version of Pong. But the thing about it is, you aren't really doing anything different. Because when I played the Oregon Trail with my son, Michael, I was immersed in it. I felt horrible. These people were dying and why didn't you get the right supplies, you idiot? Or when I was playing Legend of Zelda, I'm thinking, Link, move it. You got to pick up these hearts and you got to get to the princess. It was just the same. It's just you decide how immersive the metaphor is.
Sure. Well, and what we were talking about earlier, right? Whether or not a virtual world can become real. We're already down that road with your flat screen experiences, right? It feels real. Even if you're just playing or watching a movie on a screen, right? It's the job of the writer and it's the job of the filmmaker to make you feel for those characters, right? So it already exists after a fashion. What we're just doing right now is leveling it up, and hopefully, as this progresses, it will get freer and freer, and you'll be able to do more stuff just because you wanna, versus operating within the constraints of a particular game or a particular experience, right? Ultimately, a metaverse like the one they talk about in Ready Player One, or the one that they talk about in Mirror Shades, or any of these other sort of cyberpunk novels. Ultimately, that sort of freedom is where ultimately all of this goes. But even in a completely free environment like that, where you can go anywhere and do anything, there's still experiences that somebody crafted for you, right? There's still, you still go to the casino, you still go to the dance floor. There's still stuff there for you to do. A completely open sandbox, a completely open world where you make all of the decisions by yourself, and it's only what you put into it, is a really high lift. Like, that's a lot of work. And we have some rare examples. There's stuff like Minecraft, which basically just gave you the tools and gave you a world and said, have fun.
With horrible graphics that kids love. I try to, I know, it's weird. That's part of the draw to it.
It is. Well, and in particularly in the case of Minecraft, it's about the experience. It's the sound, and it's the way those little things pop on and pop off. In games, we call these the gameplay mechanics, right? The actual interactions that you do. And if they're really satisfying, that's really the key, is to make the interactions themselves satisfying. So if you're going to have a completely open metaverse, like something like Ready Player One, all those interactions still have to be satisfying. Picking up a cup can't be boring, because people just won't do it unless they absolutely have to, unless you've come up with a way that makes them have to pick up that cup for a reason. And that's really the biggest, I think the biggest key piece is making sure that in a virtual world, everything has to be satisfying. Opening the door has to come with a sound and like a vibrational feeling and stuff that makes your brain go, I opened the door. Even if it's just a door, right? Because we get that feedback now. Most people don't think about it. But you when you open your front door in the morning, there's a pull and a tug and a sound and a swoosh and all of those things. It's your front door. When you hear all those things, a piece of your brain goes, mine, right? There's like a little satisfying thing in there. And if it doesn't do that, then you get annoyed and you get someone out to fix it, right? Until it achieves that. So that's, it's the more open it is, the better. But I think a lot of times you've still got to have stuff that was built for people to do and things people need to engage with. Otherwise, sandboxes get boring and they get tiring after a while. Like all the work that you have to do to make the world exactly like you want it, we can't even do that in the real world. That takes it took us generations to get freeways, right? And I'm not sure anybody actually wants freeways, but like it's hard. It's really hard to do that in the real world. And it's kind of hard to do it in the virtual world as well.
But you create all these freeways, especially from, this is what I do. I love talking about this, but we have to sell your book. And I always forget. So talk about, because it touches upon what we've been talking about. Talk about mites, splat, what you use Faraday cages for. Those are three cool things that people would like to hear about.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Faraday cages is that's a very close real world analog, right? I mean, you use Faraday cages to block signal, right? You can use it to block Wi-Fi signal. If you're wearing a tinfoil hat, that's the principle behind the tinfoil hat, right? You're creating a Faraday cage which blocks signals from getting to your brain. Unfortunately, in order to actually get it to work, you would have to wrap your entire head in tinfoil, but the principle is there. The principle, the core idea is there that kind of functions. And it's weaponized in McKay's universe to isolate, spaces and places. So the reason that in the very beginning, the reason when McKay first interacts with Mike, he is in a computer in a room that has been Faraday caged, is to make sure that he can't make a connection out, through that version of Wi-Fi and escape again. It's basically a second layer of protection. And the fact that there aren't Faraday cages in certain situations later in the book are what let our antagonist sort of run amok as they're doing. It's a missing piece that that if it were in place would have kept the story from playing out as it did. But the people who were in charge at that point in time didn't think in those kinds of circles. They were thinking in more traditional medicine as opposed to sort of digital medicine. For Spike, I'm sorry, for Mike and the splat, splat is a term, it's a neologism, right? It's an in-world term for taking data and baking it into something. So, if you take a song and you put it on a physical CD, you've splatted it, right? It is put it in a sort of an immutable storage format that doesn't allow it any flexibility, right? You take a song, while it's on the internet, people can remix it. It may play well or poorly depending on bandwidth. Like it's a little bit smooshy in its existence. But once you put it onto a CD and plug it into your car to listen to, it's locked, right? You're going to get the same thing every single time. And so when they're going to splat Mike's persona, that's what they're doing, is they're taking it out of this fluid, variable, changeable space, and they are putting it on a hard drive and locking it down so that it's not going to be able to change, that there's not going to be any variations. And because of the size of a persona, the sheer amount of data, it's got to be a very specialist piece of equipment that most people don't bother putting together, because you don't normally need to do this kind of thing for a single file. You can go to Amazon and call up a semi-tractor that's full of servers and have that handle your problem. Whereas this is much more a sort of a hacker solution.
Well, it's funny because my son dragged me to this Tears for Fears garbage concert the other day, which was really, really good. And I was thinking at that time, okay, this is an analog world. I interviewed this guy who wrote The Digital Mindset. But anyway, so we're living in this analog world. You're creating, again, playing devil's advocate, this digital world. So analog is not precise, but
Correct.
and it degrades, but you're not getting ones and zeros. You're getting all the spaces in between in an analog world. Are you trying to close those spaces and make the analog and the digital world equivalent? Is that what we're talking about?
I think we're bringing them together, right? I don't think equivalency is ultimately the goal. I think a complementary set of spaces is the goal, right? In the digital world, you should be able to do things that are harder to do in the analog world. And in the analog world, you should be able to do things that are much harder to do in the digital. And ideally, humans will adapt to the technology to a point where we sort of braid them together. I mean, we do now, right? Carrying our cell phones around, we sort of have this exchange between a digital world and a real world. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it goes poorly. But I think that's the ideal state that I'm sort of trying to inspire, if you will, is this exchange between the two. One of the things we run into when doing visual design in virtual reality and in video games and in movies is, it's harder to replicate an analog world because of all the dings, because of the degradation. There are no perfect, clean, straight lines in the real world. But it's really easy when you start out as a computer artist, as a 3D digital artist. It takes time to get used to the fact that the straight lines you're creating and the perfection you're creating is deeply uncomfortable for people. This is where we get into what they call the uncanny valley, is that hyper perfection actually puts people off. So there's an art to actively making mistakes and creating things in the digital world that they don't have to replicate the real world, but they have to have enough flaws to be comfortable so that people will actually sort of buy into those spaces, as opposed to, like, every line, every corner. I mean, I do not have a single perfect 90-degree corner in my entire house, right? Even though in theory they are. And people see that flex. It's really interesting how easy it is for people to pick up on that hyper perfection and just, and they don't want it. They honestly don't want it. Makes them uncomfortable.
Well, that's a perfect example. By doing that, you're trying to increase the comfort level that people have with this environment you're creating. Can you step back and see why people are really worried about that? Are you able to do that?
Yes. I mean, well, to a certain degree, right? I can see why people are comfortable with it. I absolutely understand, sort of this ambivalence people do have. But it would be disingenuous of me to say that there's no risks, right? That this is a perfect solution. But there is a better solution out there if we spend the time solving for it. And if we just say, okay, this technology is scary, I never want to touch it, then we never get the technology to fit us, right? As people, right? The form factor never dials in, the experiences never dial in. The sort of the virtual environments in the virtual world, and sort of the somewhat brighter future I'm trying to portray in the Extractionist, is it's possible for us to use these things for better and for us to develop these things for better. But if we don't put in the work, then we're never going to get there. And it's just going to remain, a toy, or it's just going to remain something that, sucks people in and causes them to waste hours of their lives, right? It will take work to push past that. And that's what I'm trying to encourage, not the blind acceptance of this technology, not the, oh yes, everything's going to be virtual and the world's going to be fantastic. What I really want to encourage is banging on it a bit, right? And poking at it and saying, you know what, that doesn't improve my life, but if I change it here and I make it so that it's maybe not as immersive, or maybe it's something that I only have to worry about when I, put my sunglasses on and deliberately look at my computer, right? That's what I'm trying to get to is figuring out the best shape of this to make us better, as opposed to the current shape of things, which is still very, it's still very prototype. It's still very early stages. We haven't figured out all the good and the bad, but we won't get there if we don't work on it, right? If we don't figure out how people and technology interact in their best possible form. And we can't do that if we just nope out.
And the thing about McKay's world is, and you're moving towards it, is eliminating the headset. And it's just contact lenses, for example. And you may be walking down the street like in many science fiction books and see the ads calling you into the store and all that kind of stuff. But once there's no headset, you really have changed the world, if that's what you're working toward.
Right. Well, and it's, many of the societal state changes that we've had have been around the accessibility of information, right? I mean, one of the favorite ones that everybody draws up is the invention of the printing press, right? And all of a sudden, anybody who could read could access any information that was printed, right? And we pushed on this for hundreds of years. And then the internet came up. And with every one of these changes, there's always people who are like, well, if I put it in print, people will believe it. So there's always chicanery, right? There's always people taking advantage of it. But we learned to sort of counter that with books, right? We learned to look for references. We learned to, check trusted sources versus, a book we happened to pick up in the library from somebody we never heard of. And we've started to do that with the internet as well. People are starting to understand that just because it's got a picture that, and somebody puts doctor in front of their name doesn't necessarily mean that they're not a snake oil salesman, right? And I think we'll get there with the virtual as well. But, every state changes the availability of information. My ability to drive around in San Francisco and find places by using my phone versus using the Thomas Brothers guide. I don't know if you remember those, right? The city maps that came in a giant book form has made things, significantly better for traveling for me. Like if I go to Prague, I can take my phone and I will never get lost, right? Even if I don't speak the language, even if I can't do anything, it's information is freeing. It's not just that information wants to be free, but information can make you free. And so I think that when we get to the glasses or the contact lenses point, I think that we're going to see a lot of that, where people will have whatever they need to know at their fingertips. And
right.
It will.
They look at a subway sign and it's in Czechoslovakian and it's in English in a moment, which you can almost do now. Actually, Google allows you to do that. You can do that.
You can just hold up your phone and it'll translate, and it does a really good job.
I know.
It does a surprisingly good job. It's, it'll just be frictionless in the future.
Exactly.
Right. Which, and now we're getting into Babelfish territory, right? Or the universal translator that they use on Star Trek.
Or telling Google, I'd like to see a sad dog sitting in a cafe drinking a latte, which is mind blowing to me. But once again, I have done this to you. So like, as we wind down and in conclusion, the really cool thing about the book and your last is that they're also, I wouldn't call them pot boilers, but they're kind of detective stories, spy stories. How are you able to, does it all come to you? Like, you're going to, which comes first? The technology, you're going to turn it into something that's accessible to everybody in another sense as well?
It is. I mean, so I start with a what if around the technology. What if the technology went this way? What if the technology went that way? The Extraction started from a very simple place. What if, in every science fictional universe, people get stuck in virtual reality? Like Stargate did it, Star Trek did it, like, Killjoys did it, like all of these shows and these books, people get stuck. And so the what if was, okay, what if it's somebody's job to get you out? Like, what if this is so common? The reason we see this in all of these other science fiction universes is because it happens all the time. So, and that became sort of the what if. Okay, so what if it's somebody's job to pull people out of virtual reality? And then I had to expand from there. And that's sort of what drove the story. Now, there is an interesting thing to note that cyberpunk and sort of hacker narratives and programming narratives lend themselves to mysteries and thrillers because they're very intellectual. Cyberpunk is an intellectual work, right?
Sure.
Watching somebody program is not action heavy, right? It involves a lot of, it's like watching a writer. It involves a lot of staring and involves a lot of keyboard typing. But it's not action oriented the way that we think about an action movie or or an adventure novel, right? Or even sort of a classic science fiction spaceships and exploration type novel. So the thriller mystery solving is a natural fit for this genre, and it's a nice clean way to get a story that people can access because everybody's familiar with mysteries, right? You know what to do in a mystery.
What's funny though about books like yours is that when the guy comes up behind her, twists her arm, shoves her against the appliance, the refrigerator. It's like for a second you go, wait a minute, where am I?
Yep.
Because it's the metaphor.
And it's intended that way. It's intended as like a little yoink at the leash, right? To remind you that there are still real world hazards, right? Even though so much of the story takes place in the virtual.
Well, so anyway, I've been bugging you for an hour and 6 minutes, but so the book comes out July 12th, and both books are going to be out front. And I come out when I get so enthusiastic, I always come out from behind the counter, or my daughter's really good at it. She goes, "You have to buy this." And then she's so convincing that they actually do buy it. So thanks so much for coming by. It's great. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much. This was fun. This is a great discussion.
It was. I agree. Thanks again, Kimberly.
You bet. All right. Have a great week.
You too. So long.